Critical thinking does not disappear because people are foolish. It disappears because people are too tired to think. Not tired because of the lack of information, but tired because there is too much information. Tired because every day we stand before hundreds of viewpoints, thousands of voices, and countless statements spoken with absolute certainty. So instead of stopping, people learn to nod. Instead of asking questions, they learn to repeat. And very slowly, very quietly, a capacity that once defined human dignity begins to fade away without anyone holding a funeral. You may not notice the moment it happens. There is no explosion. There is no clear sign. Just one day, you find yourself sharing something without having asked whether it is true or false. Another day, you defend a viewpoint not because you have thought it through to the end, but because it makes you feel that you belong to a group. Then another day, you feel uncomfortable when hearing an opposing opinion, not because it is wrong, but because it unsettles you. And so, many people live their entire lives without ever knowing when they stopped thinking. We often call ourselves free people, free to choose, free to express, free to believe, but rarely do we ask where those choices come from. Are they truly the result of reflection, or just reactions trained by the surrounding environment? In a world where everything is packaged into slogans, headlines, short and easy to swallow statements, deep thinking becomes a luxury, and gradually, people learn to live without needing it. What is sad is that many people believe they are thinking, while in reality, they are only consuming opinions, consuming emotions, consuming prepackaged beliefs. Each time they scroll past a line of text, the brain registers a familiar feeling and calls it understanding. But understanding does not come from receiving. It comes from collision. Collision between questions and answers. Collision between what you believe and what might prove you wrong. When there is no collision, thinking becomes smooth, and that smoothness itself is the sign of a sleeping mind. There is a great paradox of this age. We live in an era of knowledge, yet it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish what is true, not because truth has disappeared, but because it is no longer sought. People do not ask what is right. They ask what many people believe. They do not ask what is well-founded. They ask what makes them feel safe. And safety, in many cases, is simply the feeling of standing in the middle of a crowd. Human beings are always afraid of loneliness, even loneliness in thought. Standing alone with a question that has no answer requires great courage. It forces us to face uncertainty, the possibility that we are wrong, the need to change how we see ourselves. And so, instead of stepping into that empty space, many people choose to cling to ready-made beliefs, not because they are right, but because they are shared by many. And wherever there is a crowd, there is a feeling of being protected. But it is precisely here that a dangerous confusion begins to form. People equate certainty with truth. They equate familiarity with understanding. They equate strong belief with deep thinking. And when this confusion repeats long enough, ignorance no longer looks like a lack of knowledge. It takes on the shape of firm belief, of personal opinion, of identity. In the past, ignorance was often tied to a lack of information. Today, ignorance is nurtured by an excess of information. When everything is available, people no longer feel the need to search for themselves. When answers appear instantly, questions become unnecessary, and when questions disappear, critical thinking disappears with them. Perhaps the most frightening thing is not that people are deceived, but that they no longer want to know whether they are being deceived or not, because knowing that means having to do something, taking responsibility, facing the inconvenience of thinking. And in a world that worships speed, slowing down to reflect is almost seen as weakness. So many people choose an easier path. They let others think for them. They let a louder voice lead the way. They let a system, an image, a set of beliefs tell them what to feel, what to fear, who to be angry at, and what to believe. At first, this brings relief, but the price paid is inner autonomy. And when autonomy is lost, critical thinking has no ground to exist. This story is not meant to accuse. It does not say that people are weak or lazy. It only says that people get tired very easily. And when tired, we let go of the things that require effort. But in that very moment, one small question can change everything. A simple question, but an uncomfortable one. Am I truly thinking, or am I just believing? That question does not need to be answered immediately. Just by being asked, a small crack appears in the wall of unconsciousness, and from that crack, light begins to enter. But to understand why people are increasingly willing to give up thinking, we need to go deeper into the new shape of ignorance in this age. The ignorance of this age does not stand outside the door of knowledge. It sits right in the middle of a room full of books. It does not say, "I do not know." It says, "I already know. No need to discuss further." And that very sentence is the clearest sign of a mind that has closed itself. Because when people stop being curious, stop doubting, stop asking whether they could be wrong, then no matter how much knowledge they possess, it becomes nothing more than decoration. In the past, people feared the dark because they could not see. Today, people fear the dark because they do not want to see. This difference matters deeply. Modern ignorance does not come from a lack of data. It comes from actively avoiding uncomfortable facts, truths that shake identity, questions that force us to reconsider our place in the world, perspectives that require us to admit that what we have long believed may only be a very small part of a much larger picture. Social media has turned this into a collective habit. Each person lives inside a stream of information so personalized it feels as if it were designed just for them. What appears before our eyes day after day slowly creates the feeling that the world thinks like us, believes like us, feels outraged like us. And when an opposing opinion slips through, it is not received as an opportunity to expand understanding, but as a threat, not a threat to truth, but a threat to the feeling of safety. People begin to react instead of thinking. They feel they must choose sides, must stand on one side, must defend a viewpoint as if defending their own identity. In that state, asking questions is no longer an intellectual act. It becomes a betrayal of the group, a betrayal of shared beliefs, a betrayal of the story they have told themselves about who they are. And so ignorance puts on a very attractive coat. It calls itself a stance, an identity, an untouchable belief. It speaks with certainty, sometimes moral, sometimes angry. But beneath that coat is not deep understanding. It is avoidance. Avoiding the discomfort of not having clear answers. Avoiding the fear of having to change. Avoiding the responsibility of thinking things through to the end. Something very subtle happens here. When ignorance is reinforced by strong emotion, it becomes almost untouchable. Reason no longer works. Evidence is dismissed as biased. Truth is judged not by its accuracy, but by which side it appears to support. And when truth is turned into a tool of emotion, critical thinking is officially pushed to the margins. But ignorance alone cannot maintain power for long. It needs support, an image for people to cling to, something strong enough to replace inner uncertainty. And right here, worship enters the story, quietly, without spectacle, but extremely effective. Worship does not begin with kneeling. It begins with unexamined admiration, with giving too much mental power to a person, an idea, an ideology, simply because it says what we want to hear. Gradually, that voice becomes the inner voice. That viewpoint becomes the lens through which we see everything else. And at this point, we are no longer thinking. We are only being loyal. What is dangerous is that worship always disguises itself as strength. It looks like certainty, like firm belief, like knowing exactly where one stands. In a world full of uncertainty, that is incredibly appealing. It helps people feel they are not lost. But the price is the flexibility of the mind. When a belief is made sacred, every question around it is seen as an offense. And so critical thinking is not killed by an external force. It is slowly suffocated from within by the need to belong, to be protected, to feel certain. People no longer ask, "Is this true?" They ask, "Is this on my side?" And when the question changes, the answer loses its original meaning. You may have felt this within yourself. A moment when you hear a different opinion and react instantly, not because it is wrong, but because it makes you uncomfortable. A moment when you defend an idea as if defending yourself. Even though deep inside a small part of you is uncertain, those moments are very human. But if we do not stop to look directly at them, they will quietly shape how we think, how we choose, and how we live. Ignorance and worship, when combined, form a closed circle. Ignorance makes us easy to believe. Worship makes us afraid to doubt. And inside that circle, critical thinking gradually becomes something strange, even dangerous. But this story does not end with society, with technology, or with the crowd, because the deepest root of all these things lies within each human being. To understand why we so easily give away our power to think, we must go even deeper into very primitive, very fragile psychological needs that all of us carry. And it is there that the truth begins to feel more uncomfortable, but also more honest. People do not turn to worship because they are weak. They turn to it because they lack a place to set their inner anxiety down. When life becomes too complex, too full of contradictions, too many questions without clear answers, the mind begins to crave an anchor, something certain, a voice that speaks for them, saying everything will be fine, that there is clear right and wrong, that believing is enough. And so worship is born, not as a moral failure, but as a deeply human psychological response. Worship does not force, it comforts. It says you do not need to think too much. You do not need to doubt. You do not need to carry the weight of uncertainty. Just follow. Just believe. Just stand on this side. In that moment, people feel lighter, and it is this sense of relief that keeps them from realizing they are giving away something essential, the right to think independently. When a person, an ideology, or an image is placed too high, it is no longer something to engage in dialogue with. It becomes something that cannot be questioned. Every mistake is excused. Every contradiction is rationalized. Every opposing piece of evidence is dismissed as malicious. Not because it has been carefully considered and found unconvincing, but because accepting it would shatter the structure of safety they are clinging to. There is a very fragile line between belief and worship. Belief allows questions. Worship forbids questions. Belief can tolerate imperfection. Worship demands absolutes. And when a belief becomes absolute, critical thinking has no place to stand. It is seen as destructive, negative, dangerous. In many communities, the one who asks questions is no longer viewed as a seeker of truth, but as a troublemaker. What is striking is that many of these people do not realize they are worshiping at all. They do not kneel. They do not swear oaths. They do not call their idol a god. They simply do not allow the possibility that what they believe could be wrong. And it is this closed state that is the clearest sign. A mind with no exits, no windows, only walls built from emotion and loyalty. Worship offers a sense of belonging. In a world where people are increasingly lonely, that feeling is powerfully attractive. When you believe like others, you are not excluded. When you speak like them, you are accepted. When you feel angry for the same reasons, you are seen as being on the right side, and gradually, acceptance becomes more important than truth. Fitting in becomes more important than being honest with yourself. If you pause for a moment, you may realize that in your own life there have been beliefs you held tightly not because you had thought them through completely, but because they helped you avoid facing an inner emptiness. The emptiness of not knowing for sure who you are, where you stand, and what truly matters. Worship fills that emptiness with quick answers, but quick answers are rarely true answers. If you are listening this far and feel something gently touching you, perhaps a memory, a doubt, or just a feeling you cannot quite name, you do not need to explain or defend it. Just let it be there. And if you want, you can leave a few lines of your thoughts. Not to argue, but to be honest. Sometimes, simply voicing a question is the gentlest way to begin an awakening. The truth is that worship does not exist only in places we easily recognize. It seeps into areas that seem highly rational. Science, politics, culture, even movements built in the name of freedom. Anywhere people stop asking questions and start defending a symbol at all costs, worship has appeared. And when worship is present, critical thinking begins to be seen as a threat. But this does not happen overnight. It is the result of countless moments when people choose comfort over honesty, certainty over truth, standing with the crowd over standing alone with their conscience. No one is forced at the beginning. It all starts with very small, very reasonable, very human choices. And that is why this story is not meant to criticize or judge. It simply invites you to look back, to look at how your beliefs were formed, to look at the discomfort you feel when someone touches what you hold sacred, to look at the moments you chose silence because you did not want to be seen as different. Those moments do not make you weaker. They only show that you are human, trying to find a place to stand in this world. If you feel this journey is worth continuing, if you want to stay and go deeper into what is happening within and around you, then walking together a little longer is only natural. Not because someone tells you that you should, but because perhaps a part of you wants to understand yourself more clearly. Because to understand why worship holds such power, we must go even deeper, into the place where the most hidden fears of human beings are formed, where the mind learns to escape uncertainty by clinging to external images. And it is there that the connection between ignorance and worship becomes clearer than ever. When ignorance and worship meet, they do not collide, they dissolve into each other. One makes the mind lazy about asking questions, the other gives the mind a place to hide, and in that combination, people gradually lose the ability to stand alone with their own thoughts, not because intelligence disappears, but because it is no longer used. It is like a muscle left unused. It does not hurt. It does not vanish right away. It simply grows weaker over time. Ignorance creates a gap of not understanding, of contradiction, of questions without quick answers. Worship steps into that gap like a gentle promise. It says you do not need to know everything. You do not need to think deeply. You do not need to face uncertainty. Just believe. And when people believe long enough, they forget that they once had the ability to ask. At the social level, this happens quietly but very effectively. When the majority no longer asks questions, powerful voices carry a lighter burden. No need to explain too much. No need to persuade with reason. Just repeat long enough, loud enough, with enough emotion, and then that repetition becomes truth in many minds, not because it is correct, but because it is familiar. History has witnessed this many times. The darkest periods do not always begin with violence. They often begin with collective exhaustion. Exhaustion from analyzing. Exhaustion from taking responsibility. Exhaustion from living in a world without simple answers. And when exhaustion reaches its peak, people are willing to hand over their power to think to anyone who promises clarity. But what matters is realizing that this process does not happen only in society as some distant entity. It happens in each individual. In every moment we choose not to read carefully. In every time we dismiss a differing opinion simply because it makes us uncomfortable. In every time we defend a belief not with reason, but with emotion. Those moments are very small, but together they form a habit, and that habit shapes how we see the world. There is a truth that is hard to accept. Critical thinking does not die because it is forbidden. It dies because it is no longer required. When no one demands that we explain, prove, or think things through, we gradually forget how to do those things. Like a language no longer spoken, it does not disappear from memory right away, but it becomes harder and harder to use, and at some point we understand when we hear it, but we can no longer speak it. In that state, worship becomes a way of life. It does not need to be public. It does not need to be extreme. It only needs enough loyalty to avoid questioning, enough silence to avoid disturbance, enough agreement to avoid attention. And in return, people are left in peace. They blend into the flow. They feel that they are living the right way. But the price of that peace is the gradual narrowing of the inner world. When we no longer argue with ourselves, the mind becomes flat. No depth, no necessary tension for growth. People may become very certain, but it is a fragile certainty. All it takes is one opposing event, strong enough, close enough, personal enough, and everything can collapse. And then, instead of rethinking from the beginning, many people look for a new idol to cling to. This cycle is very familiar. The old idol falls, a new idol is raised. Old beliefs are replaced by new ones, but the way of believing does not change. Still unconditional belief, still absolute loyalty, still a refusal to question. Ignorance only changes its shape, while critical thinking remains outside the door. This explains why many movements that claim to stand for freedom quickly become authoritarian, because true freedom does not come from changing the object of belief. It comes from changing the way we believe. When people have not learned how to live with uncertainty, they will always seek something certain to replace it, and whatever is placed in that position will sooner or later become an idol. But the story is not entirely dark, because even in times when critical thinking is pushed back, there are always individuals who choose the harder path, the path of asking questions when others remain silent, the path of thinking when doing so makes them tired and lonely, not because they are stronger, but because they refuse to live without understanding what they are believing in. These people are not always right. They are wrong many times, but they are willing to change. And that willingness is the core of critical thinking. Not knowing everything, but constantly examining. Not being certain, but being honest about what is not yet known. In a world that glorifies decisiveness, this attitude may be seen as weakness, but in truth, it requires great courage. To step out of the cycle of ignorance and worship, people must face something deeply uncomfortable, their inner fears, not vague fears, but very specific ones. Fear of being excluded, fear of being judged, fear of being seen as naive, fear of living without clear answers. And these fears are the true foundation of mental submission. If we do not look directly at them, changing idols again and again is useless. But if we dare to look, dare to admit that much of what we believe is built on the need to feel safe, then another door begins to open, a door that leads inward, where very ancient psychological mechanisms quietly guide our choices every day. And to understand why fear holds such power, we must go even deeper into how the human mind is constructed, into mental shortcuts, unconscious reactions, survival needs that have followed us for a very long time. It is there that the story of the death of critical thinking begins to take on another layer of meaning. Human beings are not born to think deeply all day. Our brains are designed to save energy, to react quickly, to survive. For most of history, that helped us stay alive. But in the modern world, this very mechanism becomes a weakness. When decisions are no longer about immediate survival, but about beliefs, values, and ways of living, fast reactions begin to replace slow thinking. And there, critical thinking is easily overlooked. The mind loves certainty. It seeks stories with a clear beginning and end, neat explanations, clear heroes and villains. Ambiguity makes it tense. Questions without answers make it uneasy. So when facing a complex world, the brain automatically looks for shortcuts. It believes what is familiar. It repeats what has already been accepted. It chooses the feeling of safety over unclear truth. Fear plays a central role in this process. It is not always a great fear. Sometimes it is just the fear of being seen differently, fear of voicing a dissenting thought, fear of being labeled, fear of not belonging. These fears are quiet, but they strongly shape behavior. When people are afraid, they stop analyzing, they look for shelter, and worship, once again, offers the familiar promise, "Follow me, and you will be safe." History shows that fear has always been an effective tool for silencing people. Fear of punishment, fear of exclusion, fear of being seen as wrong. In that state, people are willing to give up their right to think in exchange for the feeling of protection. They do not need to be forced very much. Fear only needs to be repeated, amplified, linked to images of danger, and the mind will automatically shrink back. Carl Jung spoke about the shadow, the rejected part within every human being, the doubts, insecurities, and feelings of weakness we do not want to see. When we do not dare to face that shadow, we look for an external image to represent the strength and certainty we lack. So we give power to strong leaders, flawless symbols, ideologies that claim to be the final answer. But in truth, we are handing over power that should belong to ourselves. In today's world, technology amplifies this mechanism to an unprecedented level. Algorithms do not just reflect preferences, they shape them. What we see repeatedly becomes normal. What is hidden slowly disappears from awareness. And because this process is smooth and non-coercive, people rarely realize they are being guided. They believe they are choosing, while in reality, they are only reacting. One thing worth reflecting on is that many people believe they are skeptical, when in fact they are only selectively doubtful. They doubt what goes against their existing beliefs, but unconditionally accept what reinforces them. This is not critical thinking. This is identity defense. When a belief is tightly bound to the sense of who we are, questioning it feels like threatening ourselves. Jean-Paul Sartre called this state living in self-deception. People know somewhere that they are avoiding something, but they choose not to look directly at it. Because looking means taking responsibility, admitting that one is living based on choices not fully examined, accepting that freedom is not only the right to choose, but the obligation to think about what one chooses. And so critical thinking is not only killed from the outside, it is suffocated by human beings from within, not through malice, but through avoidance, avoiding anxiety, avoiding the feeling of not knowing, avoiding the responsibility of a free human being. But this avoidance does not bring lasting peace. It only temporarily covers a deep inner lack. Because when people no longer dialogue with themselves, they become easy tools for external forces, not necessarily obvious dictators, just systems that know how to exploit fear, habit, and mental exhaustion. And when this happens on a large scale, the death of critical thinking is no longer a personal matter. It becomes a collective danger. To understand how great this danger truly is, we need to look beyond the individual mind and observe how structures of power in society take advantage of these very weaknesses. It is not accidental that in many periods, people not thinking benefits certain systems, and from here the story begins to widen into a larger picture, where ignorance and worship are no longer just psychological states, but become tools. When we look beyond the individual mind, we begin to see something far more uncomfortable. Ignorance and worship are not only random consequences of human exhaustion, they can also be intentionally cultivated, not always through clear conspiracies, but through very ordinary, very familiar structures that operate every day without being questioned. Within these structures, critical thinking is not forbidden. It is simply made inconvenient. Politics is an easy example. As the world grows more complex, people lose patience with long analyses and layered arguments. They want quick answers, simple and easy to remember, and those who can provide that gain an advantage. Slogans replace reasoning, emotion replaces data, characters replace systems. There is no need to lie completely. It is enough to simplify things until people no longer feel the need to think further. When language is impoverished, the capacity to think is narrowed as well. Complex stories are forced into simple moral frames. This side is right. That side is wrong. Good people, bad people, heroes, traitors. In that space, critical thinking becomes uncomfortable because it slows things down, blurs boundaries, and forces people to admit that reality is not as tidy as they would like. And so the one who asks questions is seen as a troublemaker, while the one who repeats is praised as loyal. But it is not only politics. Consumer culture operates in a similar way. Advertising is not designed for you to understand, but for you to want. It does not ask whether you need something. It gives you the feeling that without it, you are missing something essential. A product is no longer an object. It becomes a symbol of success, of freedom, of self-worth. And when people begin to buy in order to fill an inner gap, critical thinking is pushed to the margins. Very few people stop to ask why they truly want something, why the feeling of lack appears, why an object, an image, or a lifestyle can affect emotions so strongly. Those questions do not generate profit. They slow down consumption, and so they are not encouraged. Worship is packaged as lifestyle. Ignorance is disguised as trend. The media also plays a significant role. News today does not only compete on accuracy, it competes for attention. What provokes more outrage spreads faster. What creates more fear is remembered longer. In that flow, truth becomes something that can be bent, trimmed, or ignored if it is not engaging enough. People feel informed, but in reality they are only being constantly stimulated. When information becomes entertainment, critical thinking no longer fits the rhythm. No one has time to check sources. No one wants to read to the end. No one wants to pause in the middle of an emotional surge to ask, is this true, or is it just making me react? And gradually, reaction replaces thinking. People no longer analyze, they only respond. Technology and social media push this process even further. Algorithms do not care whether you become wiser or freer. They only care that you stay longer. Content that provokes controversy, shock, and division is often prioritized because it holds attention. In that environment, extreme views spread more easily than balanced thought, and people, without realizing it, begin to believe the world has only two sides. After living too long in such a space, the mind grows accustomed to constant stimulation. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Reflection becomes heavy. People feel they must have an immediate opinion about everything, must choose a side, must react. And in that haste, critical thinking has no chance to appear. It requires time. It requires slowing down. It requires the ability to tolerate not knowing. A society like this becomes very predictable. When people do not analyze, they react in patterns. Businesses can predict what they will buy. Politicians can predict what they will fear. Media can predict what will outrage them. And when people become predictable, they become easy to guide. No force is needed, only direction. History has shown the consequences of this. Oppressive regimes do not survive by violence alone, but by the indifference and blindness of the majority. Many people are not evil. They simply do not think. They follow. They remain silent. They believe responsibility belongs to someone else. And that surrender of thinking responsibility opens the door to collective tragedies. Even in the present age, similar patterns appear in new forms. Conspiracy theories replace mainstream beliefs, but the way of believing does not change. People do not question more deeply. They simply change the object of belief. They abandon one idol to worship another. The feeling of holding secret truth feels special, but it is still a form of escaping the responsibility of independent thought. But there is one important thing to remember. Recognizing all of this is already an act of resistance. The moment you begin to see that you are being guided, the magic of manipulation starts to weaken. It does not disappear immediately, but it is no longer absolute, because the greatest power of ignorance and worship lies in their invisibility. Once they are named, they begin to lose their strength. Critical thinking may be weakened, but it is not dead. It is only sleeping. And every time you pause before sharing something, every time you ask who benefits if you believe this, every time you allow yourself to be uncertain, you are waking it up. You do not need to do anything dramatic. You only need to be honest with yourself. However, this path is not easy. Thinking independently in a world that favors conformity often comes with loneliness. You may be misunderstood, seen as difficult, labeled negative, but history always remembers those who dared to question when the majority stayed silent, not because they were right from the beginning, but because they did not surrender their right to think. To continue on this path, we need more than awareness of external systems. We need to learn how to nurture critical thinking from within, as a way of living, not as a temporary reaction. And it is here that the story begins to turn, from the darkness of manipulation toward the light of inner freedom. There is a very quiet moment when a person stops trying to win arguments, stops needing to be proven right, and begins to return to a much simpler question. Is this true for me? Not true because the majority agrees, not true because an authority says so, but true in the deepest feeling when you are alone, unseen, unjudged. That moment marks the most important shift, not from wrong to right, but from being led to being free. Critical thinking, at its deepest level, is not a tool to oppose the world. It is a way to not lose yourself within it. When you begin to allow yourself to be uncertain, you no longer need to cling to absolute answers. When you accept that you may be wrong, you no longer need to defend yourself. And when there is no defense, the mind opens naturally, not tense, not aggressive, just awake. There is a beautiful paradox here. When you no longer need to prove you are right, you begin to learn more. When you no longer need to choose a side, you see more layers of reality. And when you no longer place your identity on rigid beliefs, you feel lighter, very light, as if you have finally set down a backpack you have carried for too long without realizing how heavy it was. This freedom is not loud. It does not make you special in the eyes of others. Sometimes, it even makes you less noticeable. You no longer react strongly to everything. You are no longer pulled into collective outrage. You no longer feel the need to say something just to prove you belong. You begin to choose silence not out of fear, but because it is unnecessary, and within that silence there is peace. Gradually, You realize that many things that once worried you do not actually need immediate answers. Many arguments that once made you tense do not actually need your participation, not because you are indifferent, but because you have learned to distinguish what deserves your thinking energy and what is just noise. That is the sign of a mature mind, no longer dragged around by every external stimulus. When you stop seeking validation from the crowd, you begin to hear your inner voice more clearly. That voice does not command. It does not promise. It simply reminds you to pause, to observe and to ask, not to doubt everything, but to live consciously with what you believe. And that consciousness brings a very strange, very new feeling, as if you are living your own life for the first time. You no longer need idols to feel strong. You no longer need an ideology to feel safe. You no longer need to stand above anyone to feel valuable. Your value does not come from what you believe, but from your willingness to take responsibility for how you believe, to face your fear, to stay with uncertainty, to change when you see that change is needed. And in that moment, many pressures fall away. The pressure to be right, the pressure to be the same, the pressure to be liked. You no longer live to be approved. You live to be honest, honest with unanswered questions, honest with your limitations, honest with the truth that being human is a journey that is never fully clear. The outside world may not change right away. The news is still noisy. Social media is still full of judgment. Loud voices still compete for attention, but inside you, something has shifted. You are no longer easily swept away. You can step out of the current when needed. You can stand still, and standing still no longer scares you. This rebirth does not look dramatic. It does not feel like a victory. It feels like the first morning after a long rain. The air is clearer. Everything is slower, and you breathe more deeply without effort. You do not need to prove that you have awakened. Living a little differently is enough. In the end, you understand that critical thinking was never about opposing anyone. It was simply a way to keep your right to be yourself, not decided for, not thought for, not lived for. And when you stand firmly in that, you do not need permission from anyone to feel at peace. Because the simplest truth, and also the most powerful one, is this: when you dare to think with your own mind, you are not just living, you are free.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.